Okay, welcome to the ASME Bitesize series. Today we've got another interesting lineup for you. We're going to be discussing two papers, but first I've got to do some housekeeping. So this session will run for 45 minutes and we will keep quite strictly to time. We do hope to take questions at some stage after the speakers have finished, but if we run out of time, we are thinking of doing an adjunct to this later on in the ASME Bitesize series. If you wish to ask a question, please use the chat field. This feature is available by clicking on the chat button, either at the bottom or the top of the screen, depending on what computer you're using. If we don't get time to answer all questions, we will provide a document after the webinar with any questions we were unable to address. The comments field is available for you to contribute to conversation. We may invite you to invite some participants to expand on their comments by asking their permission to make their audio and video live. Please respond via the chat feed that you're happy for us to add you as a temporary panelist to join the discussion and expand on your comments. This webinar is being recorded and a video will be made available on the ASME website along with the Q&A document. If you have any technical problems, we ask you to make ASME aware by emailing events@asme.org.uk rather than adding to the comments field. Thank you. So today we are going to be discussing two papers. The shortened version of the titles of these two papers are one, the Analysis of Teaching of Medical Schools Survey, and the second paper, Exploring UK Medical School Differences. I have on the panel with me today Oliver Devine, who is an MB PhD student at UCL, Chris McManus, who I'm sure many of you do know, has been probably born at UCL, he's been there that long. And of course, John Cookson, who is the Three Counties Medical School lead for Worcester, who are bidding for a new medical school. I'll come back to John later. But first, if I could ask Chris to kick off.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I need to share my screen, which... Okay, the big question we're interested in here, and I just want to do a quick overview of where this all came from, is how medical schools differ. And then, does it matter? And since we all know they differ, you know, whenever you get two medical students together from different schools, they'll say what's different about their experiences. But does it matter? So what we want to do is, look at that. I'm going to give a little bit of background just to set some of the academic context, and then we're going to talk very briefly indeed about the two studies. The papers are very long and we can't possibly summarize it all, but we'll try and give you a sense of what these papers are about. One's called Atoms, that's the one that's looking at medical, the teaching in medical schools, and the other is called MedDifs, so differences between medical schools. Okay, all of this really goes back, I suppose, to the Took report back in 2008. Do you remember the debacle on modernizing medical careers? Took inquired into it. And at the end of in the appendix to that report, they said, we need answers to some fundamental questions. And I think that's absolutely right. How does an individual student from one institution compare with another from a different institution? Where should that student be ranked nationally? And remember, this was in the context of applying for foundation. And which medical school students are best prepared for the foundation years? And crucially, what makes the difference? Now, much the same time in 2008, we also published a paper using the MRCP exam results, where we discovered that there were large differences between medical schools, graduates of different medical schools, on the performance of the three parts of MRCP. So these two things were beginning to come together. A few years later, 2014, the GMC put out this report called Be Prepared, Are New Doctors Safe to Practice? Slightly scary title. But they asked a number of questions and made some statements. And they said there are substantial variations between medical schools, particularly actually in relation to specialisation of the graduates. And they weren't sure if this was desirable or not. they were talking particularly about some medical schools producing more GPs than others. And they say on the one hand, it might reflect competition for places and so on. But on the other hand, they said those schools producing large number of GPs helping to express a key area of concern in medical staffing. And they may be more valuable to the NHS. A couple of years after that, Ian Cumming, who was then chair of the Health Education England, came out with a wonderfully controversial statement where he simply said, it's not rocket science. If the curriculum is steeped in teaching of mental health and general practice, you get a much higher percentage of graduates who work in that area in future. As always, when something's said not to be rocket science, it often transpires it's more complicated than it seems. But this really stimulated us in the work we were doing. The College of Psychiatrists, interestingly, followed down that same route, saying if you put mental health at the heart of the curriculum, you'll encourage more medical students to specialise in psychiatry. And then, quite interestingly, the president backtracked slightly and said, well, actually, the data is rather limited on that one. Finally, Oliver and I started working together on another paper. Back in 2015, we published this one. This was mainly Oliver and Andy's work. I got involved in the stats side. But there, they were looking at medical schools and how they differ in the type of assessment they give in the exams. And just to summarize, that give a sense of it, what you can see here, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but you can see the amount of assessment across a course varies dramatically across medical schools, and also medical schools are using different types of assessment. So that was a precursor to the present study. So let's just briefly look at the two studies. I'll introduce atoms and then Oliver's going to talk a bit more about it. Then I'll come back to MedDifs. These are the two studies. They've each got their other fancy coloured logos. And you can see they've got long titles and they've got very long lists of authors. If we want to know what they're about, the opening lines actually summarize it quite well. The ATOM survey starts, medical schools teach, that much is obvious, but what subjects they teach, what ways they teach, and how much they teach each subject is very unclear. There's very little information on teaching. And the second paper starts out, medical schools differ, but whether those differences matter is a separate issue. The other thing to say about these papers is, I've highlighted it here, the large number of authors involved. And I think this is a key feature of these papers. They're very unusual in that sense for medical education papers. And these all come back to Oliver, and he set up what's called the Medical Student Investigators Collaborative, MSICO, and that was the underpinning for doing this sort of research. We couldn't have done it on our own, I think it's fair to say. Okay, at this point, Oliver is going to take over and talk about atoms.
Okay, so thanks, Chris. And thanks, Derek and ASME for organising this and inviting me to say a few words about this paper. So the first paper, as Chris has already said, is called Atoms, and that's we came up with this sort of fancy backronym, which is analysis of teaching of medical schools. And what this goes back to is sort of in 2013, I'd finished preclinical medicine in Kiel. I'd transferred to Birmingham to do an intercalated degree. And then I'd moved to UCL to start the MD PhD. So I had this very sort of movement from north to south across the country. And I'd experienced teaching at 3 different medical schools that are quite different. So Kiel, of course, being this sort of quite well-established PBL course off the back of the previous Manchester course, Birmingham and UCL being considerably more traditional. So I found Chris's 2008 paper on the differences in MRCP, and I'd been thinking for quite some time, you know, how much does this difference in medical school teaching really matter? Is it going to affect me as a student? Am I going to have a different experience as a foundation doctor? Am I going to be a better or a worse doctor? And so to find Chris's paper, 2008 paper showing such differences in MRCP, I was a little worried, to tell you the truth. And I thought, well, surely we can figure out, you know, what influences postgraduate performance. And we kind of came up with these 3 things: assessment, teaching, and the learning culture of a school, which may contribute to postgraduate performance. And the low-hanging fruit, because it was really the easiest thing to quantify, was assessment. So we went for assessment first, and that was the paper that Chris just spoke about. where we showed there were big differences between medical schools, and it does seem to influence postgraduate performance, or at least contribute to the variance in postgraduate performance. So after we finished assessment, we thought, well, teaching is probably the next easiest thing to go after. You know, if you want to go and quantify a culture, I'd say that's actually probably quite a challenging thing to do. So teaching was the next step if we want to explain some of the variance in postgraduate performance. So we went and tried to measure that. Yeah. So what did we measure? We wanted to know what was taught at the medical schools. We wanted to know how it's taught, and we wanted to know sort of how much teaching takes place on each particular topic. So we identified 28 medical schools with established A100 courses. So that's your sort of standard 5 or 6 year medical course in the UK that most applicants will be applying to. We had to exclude Plymouth and Exeter because they were in the middle of a divorce at that particular time, and things were not quite complete with their new courses. There were a couple of newer schools that again didn't have a standard sort of established course. And we submitted FOI requests, Freedom of Information requests, for the full, and I will stress complex, timetables for each of the courses for the 2014 to 2015 academic year. Now, FOI is, you know, it's one way of getting information. 2 schools did refuse. 1 school excluded from our analysis because basically we couldn't get the data analysed quickly enough. And we ended up with 25 schools with a detailed data that we could put forward for analysis. So we recruited, as part of this MCCO group that Chris just spoke about, 3 to 10 medical students from each school, and those students were then going to look at their own timetables that they would be familiar with and code it according to a standardized pro forma. And so to give some idea of how long a project like this takes, we started this in 2016, not long after the assessment paper. We started on teaching, and the actual recruitment of students at medical schools to do the data analysis took us just under a year. At the same time, we were putting in Freedom of Information requests to collect the timetable data from the medical schools with, you know, various levels of success, and that was definitely a process that we chipped away at it over the space of a good 12 months. We then had enough data to send it out to the students to do the timetable coding, which again took about a year. And then we sort of cogitated over the data for quite a while, and mercifully had a relatively short peer review period. And of course, we published. Now, what I would say is when we finished this, we had 47,258 teaching events, which is actually rather a lot. And that's across 25 schools. And when we're talking about teaching events, we're talking about the smallest indivisible raw unit of teaching, and we're measuring that in hours. So each event we classified according to format. So for example, is it a lecture? Is it PBL? Is it a ward round? Is it a supervised teaching event? Or is it the kind of teaching event where a student goes off to a ward, they're instructed to go off to a ward and just do some learning, which does happen, you know, relatively frequently. We then classified each event according to the content of that teaching. So is it anatomy? Is it physiology? Is it biochemistry, cardiology, orthopedics? You know, we did actually try and manage to remember every possible clinical topic and specialty, and a few did get through the gap in our sort of preemptive planning. So we established the start time and the finish time for every teaching event and the duration. So this allows us to then plot this. So on the x-axis, we're looking at the number of each medical school we have in our analysis, and on the y-axis, we're showing the total number of hours of teaching. So you can see that the vast majority of schools are sort of creeping up above this 5,500 hours, which is actually the minimum amount of teaching stipulated by the Medical Act 1983. And that's quite reassuring, isn't it? That most medical schools teach what they're required to do by law. But what you will note is in red, we're including self-regulated learning. So actually, a lot of the teaching that takes place at medical schools, if you take out the self-regulated learning, there are some schools that start to just drop down below that sort of critical line. Now, you get an impression that there is a significant amount of variance, which is also quite important. And now what this table, and it is an extremely complicated overview, and don't pay a great deal of attention to it, but what I'm trying to illustrate here is you have all the different methods of teaching and the content types of teaching. So is it anatomy, dissection, practical, PBL, and then biochemistry, anatomy, etc. And we have the schools across the top, and the red boxes are indicating where there is rather a large amount of a particular teaching, and the blue boxes are indicating where there's rather a small amount. So if you, for example, took PBL and went across, you'd see blue boxes, and we get to these red boxes, and it just so happens that, unsurprisingly, yes, these are the PBL schools that teach a rather large amount of PBL. So we can pull a lot out of this data, and I would say go and read the papers, because we've done a lot of sub-analyses, but what we want to focus on today is really this PBL versus non-PBL. So this is a factor analysis, and if we start out by looking on the left, we're showing how different teaching types and topics cluster according to how traditional a course is, which is kind of a measure of how much PBL they have, and how structured a course is, which is kind of a measure of how much unsupervised teaching students undertake. So what you can see is that there are certain clusters that start to emerge. So you have your PBL schools, sorry, you have your PBL teaching kind of clustering with your GP teaching here on the left, and then you've got clusters of biochemistry lectures and neurobehavioral and physiology on the right. And so you start to see that there may be some sort of a natural clustering of these schools. And if you plot onto the same factor analysis the individual medical schools, you see that there is a division. And these colours that we're showing, the blue and black, they are not colours that we have invented. These are how schools self-identify, whether they self-identify as PBL schools, over here with a slightly more PBL, unsurprisingly, a slightly more structured course, or here on the right with the traditional schools. So there is this natural tendency to divide across PBL, non-PBL lines. And to just pull out some headline points on what we found with regards to the differences between PBL and non-PBL schools. Again, unsurprisingly, they have a lot of PBL, 12 times as much PBL. When we say non-PBL school, we're not saying they don't do any, because actually the vast majority of schools do some. However, a true PBL school is doing in the order of hundreds of hours of PBL across the course, whereas your non-traditional school your sort of traditional school is doing somewhere in the region of 10 hours. They have twice as much early clinical experience at PBL schools. They have about 60% of the preclinical teaching of a traditional school, and only 70% of the lectures of a traditional school. And of course, as shown by the factor analysis, oh, I don't know what just happened there. Can I go back? No, I can't. Chris, can you go back? Yes, brilliant. Yes, so
some reason it's given control back to me. Okay, let's stick to that one.
Fine. So 70% of the lectures of a non-PBL school, and 50% more GP, which goes back to the factor analysis. But overall, a very similar amount of teaching. And then the next thing that we asked, you see these differences across this very clear PBL, non-PBL divide. And you have to ask the question, does that matter? And that then naturally leads on to the next paper, which is MedDifs, that Chris is now going to speak about.
Okay, thanks very much, Oliver. This is going to be a very selective look at just a few aspects of the MedDifs study. You can see from the title, we're looking at institutional histories, selection, teaching styles, everything you can think of. And we wanted to see how medical schools differ. We did look at PBL because it's such a major division within UK medical education. We had slightly more schools this time because we had more data from those that weren't in the ATOMS study. We had 11 PBL or CBL and 18 non-PBL. We then tried to get as many measures as we could. And this was data that was in the public domain in some sense. We could find it. And then Oliver talked about the culture. We tried to summarize some of that. And you can see this is just a list of the measures. We can look at their history. Medical schools are described by their history in many ways. What influences their curriculum, how they select their students. And remember, much of the time that's self-selection. What do we know about teaching, learning and assessment? And the ATOMS data are in there. How satisfied are they? We had data from the National Student Survey. How did they do on the foundation scores, the EPM and the SJT? We had data from the National Training Study Survey on their, how they felt about the F1 performance. We knew about quite a few things about the choice of specialty training, in particular GPs. We had quite a lot of data on postgraduate exams, either pass-fail or in many cases, more finely grained detail than that. And we also knew differences in fitness to practice issues coming from the GMC. So we had a lot of stuff, and we can't possibly talk about it all here. We do in the paper, and you can go off and look at that. Let's just think though on those 50 measures, what are the differences between PBL and non-PBL schools? And down the side here, you'll see the 50 measures we're talking about. And across here, we've got the non-PBL, and here we've got the PBL schools. We did some significance tests, and only the ones in bold are significant. Let's just pull those out. And in fact, of those, when you do a one for any correction, only 4 of them end up as significant, 5 of them. One of them is that they tend to be more traditional. That's not surprising, as Oliver would say. The PBL schools do more PBL. There are other interesting differences, though. The PBL schools have lower entry grades on average than the non-PBL schools, and that's liable to affect other things. When you come down here, the PBL schools actually do less well. The graduates of the PBL schools do less well on postgraduate exams, and that applies in particular to one exam, the applied knowledge test of MRCGP. So they're doing less well on that exam, but then they have got lower entry grades. And finally, if we look at ARCP, we can find out whether they've got problems not in exams, because exams have been talked about here. And the PBL schools actually have higher rates of problems with non-exam conduct issues. So there's a number of interesting differences here. Now, we can look in detail at this. I'm only going to show you the flavor of it. You know, there's much too much here. But down the side, we've got all the 50 measures. And across the top, we've got the same 50 measures. I mean, this is a correlogram. We can look at how these correlate with one another. And we spend a lot of time in the paper unpacking what on earth is going on here. There are 2 big questions we want to look at. And I'm actually only going to look at the first one here. And that's this question that was brought up by Health Education England. Is it rocket science that if you teach more general practice, more people go into that specialty? So let's just have a look at that. Here I've pulled out all the specialties now. I've reorganized that table before, so we've got fewer measures. And so for instance, in general practice, we've got history of producing GPs in a school, how much GPs is taught, how many trainee people go into trainees in general practice, and then performance in the MRCGP exams. And we've tried to do the same thing then also psychiatry, anesthetics, O&G, internal medicine and surgery. Now we're really interested in these little bits of the table. And here I just highlighted the row to do with teaching. Ignore the GPs for the moment, but the most striking thing is that actually in all the other specialties, it doesn't matter how much more or less teaching you do in it, it has no relation to anything else. So that's actually quite an important issue. What about the GPs? Well, when we look at them, what we see is that the more GP is taught in a medical school, the more people become trainees in general practice. So that's good, that's what you'd expect. The issue though, is these 2 red boxes here, these are negative correlations. In other words, the more teaching you do in general practice, the less well people do on the MRCGP exams. Now that may sound a bit unlikely, so let me just show you in a bit more detail. What we've got here is a graph. Here's the amount of GP teaching, and you can see there's some schools with nearly 700 hours. There are other schools with just over 100 hours. The schools are indicated. The yellow boxes, by the way, indicate that they're problem-based learning schools. This is the percentage of their graduates going on to become trainees in general practice. And I think there's no doubt about the strength of that correlation. And you can see that the yellow boxes are more up this end because the PBL schools are teaching more general practice. The tricky one to understand though is this one, because now we've got the same measure of teaching hours in general practice. But now we've got performance on the MRC GP's applied knowledge test, and the relationship is clearly downwards. Interestingly, there are two outliers, Oxford and Cambridge. Oxford doesn't actually teach very much GP, but it has by far the best performance of any university, any medical school on the GP's exams. Cambridge teaches more, but it also does better. But you'll also see that there are other schools which aren't PBL that don't do much teaching, which are actually doing quite well on the exams and so on. So, and by the way, we can do the same thing for the clinical skills assessment. So this isn't just book knowledge. Oxford still comes out way out the top here. Just briefly, what about psychiatry? Because of course we saw that quote from the College of Psychiatrists earlier. Well, there's the scattergram for the amount of teaching of psychiatry. There's the number of psychiatry trainees, and the lines show that there's simply no relationship really. And you can compare Oxford and Cambridge here. They have much the same teaching of psychiatry. Oxford produces loads of psychiatrists, Cambridge hardly produces any. But there's no relationship here really. We could go on and ask about other questions. This one is so complicated, I'm not going to talk about it. I can only say go off and read the paper. But at that point, I think that's enough to give you a sense of what we were trying to do. I want to thank you for the opportunity to describe it. I also have to thank our huge number of co-authors. This really is an interesting collaborative project, which I don't believe we could have done without having a method like this. And I think that's quite exciting and interesting. Thank you. See if I can come back to the main screen. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much indeed for those two presentations. We've had one comment from Sheffield questioning whether it should be classified as a PBL or not, but I don't think we want to go into that at the moment. I'd like to turn now to Professor John Cookson, who has a long history of involvement in medical schools, setting up the Hull York Medical School, the Warwick Medical School, sorry, getting confused with my W's. He's currently lead for the Worcester, and also set up a medical school in Botswana. And what are your reflections, John, on someone with that extensive involvement in medical schools, both curricular-wise and PBL versus non-PBL?
Well, it was all very interesting. I like papers that overturn perceived wisdom, and this one certainly did that. And as I put it, it slaughtered several sacred cows, things that we've accepted as being de rigueur for a long time in medical schools. But what would a dean or somebody running a medical school do with this information? And it really depends on what you want. But if you want your students to do well in postgraduate exams, then it's clear that there's an academic spine that runs through all this. And wherever you are, if you do well academically, you do well. And you do well in what we would think would be non-academic areas. So there's something there about the person, I think, and all the relationship between academic and non-academic. So what you would do if you were thinking about widening participation, which of course we all do, you by all means do that, but don't at the same time lower your entry criteria, because if you do, you'll do less well in postgraduate exams, and probably when it comes about the MLA. And of course, if medical schools are then put in some sort of league table, as they will, and probably quite rightly, then if you're at the top, if you're at the bottom, it's another issue, and that gives rise to problems, because most of the evidence seems to suggest that the medical schools don't do much, actually. Their influence is comparatively slight, perhaps compared with the type of people who come in, both in terms of academia and in terms of personality and what they want, their career goals. So by far the biggest selection is the student. We don't select them, they select us. And what we do with them after that makes comparatively little difference, particularly when we try to train people for particular or educate them for particular areas like general practice or psychiatry. So I think the dean in your school, your producer school, has got some hard thinking to do about what they actually want and the limitations that are imposed. And if you wanted to try and do something different, more GP, for example, it would be difficult to do to create such a large amount of extra general practice to actually make a difference. So I think the end result is that medical schools are different, but they're probably different in their own way. They're of themselves. They're entire of themselves. If you try and impose some change, it may on the one hand not work, but on the other hand, it might create quite unintended consequences, which would be detrimental. So I think the whole thing, these two papers do need a lot of study and a lot more work done, a lot more thinking about them. It's going to be interesting to see what comes out. One issue proposed in the paper is to, and I just see it's come up on a chat box, is to allocate students randomly to medical schools. And that's basically the only way you're going to do it to get the product the same at the end. Well, do we want to go there? Well, over to you. Thanks.
I've got just one to kick off with before we hopefully get some more online is, you know, having both to you, Oliver and Chris, you know, having gone through this paper and whatever, and I know John has mentioned the MLA, which is allegedly the great leveler coming forward, but that's another bite size, I think, to discuss all of that. What major changes do you think are needed to, if you like, level the field or give patients the confidence that, you know, 50% at one medical school is 50% at another, and therefore, to use the pilot analogy, you know, you've passed and you are safe.
Oliver, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think the UKMLA is actually the solution to that problem. If you want to have reasonable, comparable, quantifiable measurements on performance, the question of whether or not you're measuring something useful with the MLA is a whole separate issue. But, you know, having gone through the process of these two papers, what I would say is that we've learned that we still need more information, and more information can only come through being able to perform these kinds of large quantitative studies. And I think Chris has mentioned a couple of times that actually being able to perform trials in medical education is probably the most important part of understanding exactly what the outcomes are in the long term for doctors. And, you know, moving to a place of being able to do real sort of randomized controlled trials in medical education is what I would like to see happen. You know, the sort of macro level thing that I would like to see happen next.
I can only agree entirely with that. I think there are other ways of doing it as well, though, and better data is part of it. You know, one of the issues, for instance, with the MLA, we don't really know how schools differ, but actually we've had the SJT in finalists, and we've also got the PSA, the Prescribing Skills Assessment, in finalists. Those data aren't in the public domain, but I assure you they look extremely similar to the other results. There's exactly the same ordering of medical schools. So I've got no doubt that MLA will end up doing the same thing. If we want to change one thing actually here, what we need is better data. And that's the hard bit to get. And I think UKMed, the UK Medical Education Database, is about to transform all of this. You know, I'm heavily involved in it, so I have an interest here. But there is data which previously was not around. What we've done in our MedDifs paper is to put together stuff which was floating around independently. And we've really fixed it together and then added in the atoms data as well. But I think that needs to be done much more systematically. Evidence, evidence, evidence probably is what we need.
On this point about better data, of course, we've had a comment that you may have already seen there, which was the decision to use an FOI as a method of collecting the data, and whether that's you'd have got better information and better quality. by using a less aggressive approach was the comment. Is there anything to say about that? Two medical schools didn't play ball anyway. So.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say to that is we went through the approach of speaking directly to medical schools for the assessment paper that we did in 2015, and yes, you can get it. It was already a difficult process to get this through FOI, but from our experience with assessment, it was very hard to get schools to consent to hand over information about what assessment they do. In terms of the completeness of the data through the FOI approach, actually, it was perfectly complete. There was very little holding back of information, and 26 out of 28 was pretty good in our book. And I think the other two actually were eventually compelled to hand the data over, but it was just too late to include in the study. As for whether it's an aggressive approach or not, I mean, yeah, you can make the argument that it seems aggressive, but equally, you would counter that by saying these are publicly funded, by and large, publicly funded institutions, and the data should be released anyway. It's not commercially sensitive data.
Yeah, and the Information Commissioner censured both of those medical schools for not providing what should be in the public domain, I think. So there's nothing secret about this, and there's very little benefit to be gained by it. We hear about league tables, but actually medical schools are probably the very last institutions no longer to be involved in league tables. Primary schools, secondary schools, universities, cardiovascular surgeons and so on, they're all in league tables. And it's not clear to me why medical schools should be exempt from that. The GMC publishes league tables on performance at a postgraduate medical schools, the postgraduate medical exams for every medical school in the country. They're on their website, and they say the Medical Act requires them to do that. They can't put out anonymized data. So I think there's a sense here in which, it is the last bastion of not putting out data.
Thank you. I've got a question here from the audience, as it were. So is achievement in postgraduate specialty exams what we are aiming for as a marker of success?
I'll come in on that one because the answer is clearly not, or rather clearly not as the only criterion of postgraduate success. But doctors who fail their exams and are not very good at their specialties are probably not what the public wants or desires. And therefore, and if we want excellence in clinical care, then part of that is knowing the knowledge. Yes, we'd love to know about how well they communicate and all sorts of other things about them. The trouble is, there's simply no data out there. If people believe those other aspects of being a doctor are important, then they need to get out there and tell us how the doctors vary, and we can then work out how that relates to other things. But yes, so measure, measure, measure. Same principle.
It is part of a much wider problem, which is how do we assess the non-assessable? We count what we can count, but what we can count doesn't always count. What counts, we can't count. And it runs within the whole of medical education and probably much wider too. But so if we had some methods, we might do better on it. But people will count, will look at what's visible. And what's visible is success in postgraduate exams and make their own judgments.
I think that's right. But I think, I started teaching communication skills in a medical school in London in the 1980s. We've been teaching it now for 30 years. We assess it in OSCEs. We assess it in postgraduate exams. And what we haven't done here is to partial that out. But if we feel it's important, we can describe when it goes wrong, then, I'm a psychologist. We measure the unmeasurable. That's our job. And I feel we ought to be able to get measures of those sort of things.
Another question here. How do we consider this information with the development of private medical schools in the UK?
I think we ought to be able to do the same thing with private schools as we do with public schools, public funded schools. I think insofar as the private medical schools will add to the N and possibly increase the variance, from a research point of view, they can only help us understand what's going on in a better way. They may be more variable. They may do things differently. That's their privilege in a way. and we can then decide whether or not it gives better or worse outcomes. Yeah.
Just an add-on to that, Chris, really, and part of what I've been thinking about private medical schools is that many of them seem to have a greater focus on education, teaching, training, because they don't have necessarily the emphasis on the academic research element. Now, without going into the you should be learning in an academic environment argument, another ASME Bitesize, I suggest, if you had league tables, I would fully expect the private medical schools to be right up there at the top in terms of the educational components, satisfaction, whatever. Is that your view?
I think it's more than possible, but I think it's a bit like the National Student Survey measures. High satisfaction scores in these data actually relate to poorer performance at postgraduate exams. So there's a sense in which, you know, they may want to try and teach better, they may be doing it, but it may not actually be having its outcome. That may also reflect into differences in intake. Different people will go to private schools for various reasons. And teasing it all apart is actually quite hard.
Okay, well, we're absolutely running out of time. What I would like just to give the last word to John, who's right in the midst of developing a new medical school at Worcester, as to whether these papers will change or alter your thinking or direction that you're planning for the next couple of years.
We are commissioned to produce more GPs and more psychiatrists. We know how to produce more GPs. We don't know how to produce more psychiatrists, except by selecting people who want to become psychiatrists. If anyone knows how to do that, then I would be most interested to hear from them. As to the future, well, to be controversial, I think that things should stay as they are. Because if the schools are different and different in their own way, and they do things well in their own way, that's something to be valued. If we try and make everybody the same by the MLA or whatever, then we may throw out the babies with bathwater. That would be my thought.
Well, I'm sure if there's anyone from Med School Councils in the audience today, they'd be very happy to those final few words. John, thank you. I know there's been lots more questions, and we will find a way of answering those for you. I think we are going to do a further ASME Bitesize on this topic, and it may be we will hone down on certain aspects of the two papers so that we can have a more in-depth discussion again, and we've used this technically, if you like, as an introduction to the subject. So we will get back to you with regard to that. I really would like to thank the panelists for their papers and input to today, and also my backroom staff in the office at ASME for producing this. As I said, this is just one of several. Please look at the ASME website. We are doing these regularly. We're hoping for at least one a week between now and January, which is quite a tall order, but we're going to give it our best shot, just so to keep in contact with the membership and keep medical education to the forefront. Thank you all very much indeed.